The sun was relentless, beating down on the dry land like judgment, making the earth shimmer in the heat. Dust swirled around Caleb's boots as his horse trotted slowly across the barren landscape. The air was thick, dry, like the whole world was holding its breath. Caleb, a lone cowboy with the weight of solitude etched deep into his worn face, was used to the silence. He preferred it that way. He had his ranch, his routine, and nothing else mattered. Until now, the first scream reached him like a distant cry, barely audible against the wind. But Caleb's instincts were sharp. He pulled the reins, bringing his horse to a halt, listening. The scream came again, this time sharper, more desperate. A woman's scream. His heart kicked in his chest. It was close. Without thinking, he spurred the horse forward, pushing it faster through the dry grass, the rhythmic thud of hooves and the whistling wind his only companions. The scream echoed in the distance, and Caleb's pulse quickened. He'd been in these parts long enough to know that nothing good came from someone in trouble, especially not out here. The landscape stretched wide and empty. But as he neared a bend in the road, the sound grew louder. He saw it then, a figure in the distance, something against the backdrop of the railway track. His eyes narrowed. A woman. She was tied to the tracks, struggling, her body jerking violently against the ropes that held her in place. The train's whistle cut through the air, distant but growing louder, sending a chill through Caleb's bones. The train was coming. Panic flickered in Caleb's chest. He didn't know who she was, but he couldn't just ride past and leave her to die. Without thinking, he pulled his knife from his belt and urged his horse faster, the galloping hooves pounding in his ears. The woman's head jerked toward him as he approached, her face a twisted mask of terror, eyes wide and frantic. The closer he got, the more he could see. The sun had already drained the color from her skin, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. Her hands were bound tightly, and she fought against the ropes as if the very act of struggling would keep her alive. But Caleb saw something else, something deeper in her eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in his own reflection for too many years, resignation. He reached her just in time. The train's whistle was deafening now, the heavy rumble of the engine vibrating through the ground beneath his boots. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't waste time. Swinging down from his horse, he pulled his knife from his belt and cut through the thick rope with a single, swift motion. The woman's breath hitched as the ropes fell away, and she collapsed into his arms, trembling. "Come on," Caleb muttered, his voice low but urgent. He didn't know why he was doing this. Hell, he didn't even know her name. But he couldn't leave her there, couldn't let her become another ghost in the wind. The train was nearly upon them now, the sound deafening as it grew closer, closer, a beast on the tracks. He pulled her up onto his horse, her weight light against him as she clung to him, too weak to protest. The train was close, too close. Caleb urged the horse forward, his muscles straining as he pushed the animal faster. The woman was silent now, her head resting against his chest, and Caleb didn't know if she was alive, unconscious, or if the world had already broken her beyond repair. But he wasn't going to stop. The train roared past them, its massive body shaking the ground beneath their feet, the wind so strong it felt like it could knock them off course. Caleb barely felt the blast of air. His focus was on getting her away from the track, away from the sound of that train, away from whatever nightmare she'd been dragged into. When they were far enough, he slowed the horse, breathing hard. The woman, still in his arms, hadn't moved, her face pale and drawn. Caleb could feel her chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't out of danger yet. He glanced back toward the track. The train was disappearing into the horizon now, leaving nothing but the dust and the echoes behind. He looked down at the woman in his arms again, his brow furrowing. She hadn't said a word, and he wondered if she even had the strength to. Caleb didn't know what to do. He hadn't planned on being anyone's savior today. He hadn't planned on anything but the quiet of his ranch and the routine he'd built for himself. But here he was, holding a stranger, a woman who had been tied to the tracks like an animal, and he couldn't help but feel responsible. He couldn't leave her. Not like this. He clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward again. The dusty road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, as if the world had paused to watch. The woman's breathing was steady now, but her grip on him remained tight. She wasn't ready to let go. "Who did this to you?" Caleb muttered, but she didn't answer. He didn't expect her to. As they rode off, the landscape faded behind them, but the feeling of that train bearing down on them, the sound of it rushing by, stayed with him. The memory of the woman, her eyes wide with fear and desperation, was burned into his mind. There was no going back now. Whatever had happened to her, wherever she had come from, Caleb knew one thing. He wasn't leaving her to fend for herself. Not today. The journey ahead was unknown, but it had already started. And Caleb had a feeling that the woman in his arms, whoever she was, would change everything. Caleb urged the horse forward, his grip tight on the reins, not daring to slow down. The woman in his arms, still limp and silent, pressed against his chest with the weight of someone who had been through far too much. Her breath was shallow, and Caleb could feel her tremble slightly, even through the thick layers of dust and sweat that coated both of them. The dust from the dry land swirled up in clouds, clinging to their clothes as they rode. Caleb's mind raced, but his hands remained steady on the reins, guiding the horse down the winding trail. The sound of the train's whistle still echoed in Caleb's ears, though it was distant now, fading into the endless stretch of empty land behind them. The immediate danger had passed, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something more was waiting around the corner. He had no idea who this woman was or why she had been left to die on the tracks, but the desperation in her eyes had been enough to pull him into her world, and now there was no turning back. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft, almost inaudible sound, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, the words slow and thick, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. Caleb's grip on the reins tightened slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say to her. Thank you for what? For saving her from the tracks? For pulling her from a fire of whatever past had led her to this moment? "Don't mention it," he finally replied, his voice low and rough, as if the words came from somewhere deeper than just the surface. He didn't want to make promises or act like a hero. He didn't want to feel anything for her. After all, he barely knew her. But still, something stirred inside him. He couldn't deny it. The world was full of people who needed saving, and this woman wasn't the first he'd come across. Yet, her face haunted him. She shifted slightly against him, adjusting her position on the horse, her body tensing as though she were still bracing for another blow, another disaster. Caleb glanced down at her. She wasn't fragile, but the way she held herself spoke of someone who had been through far too much. A young woman, with the body of someone who had carried burdens long before her time. Her face, though pale and weary, still held a quiet strength. Caleb didn't know why, but it made him want to protect her. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice stronger now, though still laced with a sort of hesitation, as if she feared the answer. It was a simple question, but the way she asked it made Caleb pause. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance, no longer a helpless woman tied to the tracks. She was a person with a past, with a story, with a life. He couldn't simply ignore that. "I've got a place out here," he said, his voice steady. "A ranch. It's not much, but it's safe. You'll be able to rest there." He didn't offer her much detail. What was the point? She wouldn't care about the condition of the ranch or the few horses grazing in the field. She just needed somewhere to catch her breath, somewhere to get away from the demons chasing her. For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of hooves on the dirt road and the wind that seemed to carry away the remnants of the day. The horse's rhythm was steady, matching the pace of Caleb's thoughts. He had been alone for so long that it was almost strange to have someone with him now, especially someone like her. A woman who had clearly been hurt, someone whose past was wrapped in pain. He didn't want to know her story, not really. People like her, people like him, didn't share their pasts. They kept their wounds buried deep. But then, as if sensing Caleb's unspoken thoughts, she spoke again, her voice stronger this time. "I'm not going to be any trouble." She said it matter-of-factly, but the way her words landed in the air told Caleb that it wasn't just a statement. It was a plea, an unspoken promise to him. She didn't want to be a burden. "I didn't think you would be," Caleb replied quietly. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only exists between people who've seen too much, felt too much, and aren't afraid of each other. Mercy wasn't looking for pity, and Caleb wasn't offering any. They didn't need to talk much. The understanding between them was there. The ride continued in that heavy silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Caleb could feel the tension between them, not out of fear, but out of something unspoken, something that had already begun to take root. There was a bond forming, something unexpected, something neither of them had planned. But neither of them seemed to fight it, either. As they neared Caleb's ranch, Mercy looked up, her dark eyes scanning the horizon. Caleb could feel her gaze, but he didn't turn to look at her. Instead, he focused on the path ahead, the small, solitary house growing larger in the distance. It was modest, but it was home. He didn't want to bring her there. Not yet. Not until he knew more about her, until he understood why she had ended up like this. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow across the landscape, Caleb knew there was no turning back. Mercy was with him now. Whatever happened, they would face it together. He didn't know if she would stay. He didn't know if she wanted to. But he wasn't going to leave her alone. The ranch was closer now, the distant sound of the windmill creaking in the breeze. Mercy's grip on Caleb loosened slightly, and for the first time since he'd found her, he saw a small flicker of hope in her eyes. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the house, at the possibility of safety, of rest. "Almost there," Caleb said, his voice softer than usual. Mercy didn't respond, but Caleb could feel her relax, just a little, as they approached the ranch. It wasn't much, but for now, it would have to be enough. Caleb guided the horse toward the small, weathered barn as the sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air was cool now, the harsh heat of the day easing into the quiet of the evening. As they neared the ranch, Mercy's grip on him loosened, but she didn't move away. She hadn't said much since they left the railway track, and Caleb wasn't sure whether to push her for more or let her keep her silence. They rode up to the porch, and Caleb dismounted first, his boots crunching on the gravel as he reached for her. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking over the small house, taking in its simplicity. It wasn't much. A modest place, a house and a barn, some fields beyond. The kind of life Caleb had built after his wife's death. Quiet, solitary, and predictable. "You can rest here," Caleb said softly, offering his hand to help her down from the horse. Mercy's eyes met his, still guarded, but there was a flicker of something in them, a tiredness, a longing for peace, maybe even a hope that this place, this moment, could offer her something she hadn't found before. She took his hand, her fingers cool against his. She didn't need help, but she didn't pull away either. With a small, reluctant sigh, she slid down from the horse and stood in front of Caleb for a long moment. He saw the wariness in her stance, the way she kept her body slightly turned away, almost like she was expecting him to ask for something, expecting him to demand something of her. He didn't. "This way," Caleb said, gesturing toward the door. The house was simple, the room small but clean. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Caleb led her inside, watching her as she hesitated in the doorway, her gaze scanning the room like she was searching for something to make her feel comfortable. The space smelled faintly of pine and tobacco, the scent of a place lived in, yet untouched by the mess and clutter of too many people. There was a fire burning low in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the wooden floor. A single tin plate rested in the sink, an old shirt hanging from the hearth drying too close to the flame. The place was lived in, but it was empty of the things that made a home truly warm. There were no pictures, no signs of a life beyond the bare necessities. Mercy stood at the threshold, looking uncertain. Caleb could see her weighing the choice, whether to step inside or turn and leave. He didn't push. She needed to decide for herself. He wasn't going to force her. After a long pause, she stepped inside, her boots silent against the wooden floor. Caleb watched her for a moment before he turned to head toward the kitchen. "I'll get you some food," he offered. It was a simple gesture, but he didn't know what else to offer her. She hadn't eaten since he found her, and that was something he could do. Mercy followed him in, but she didn't speak. She was still quiet, still guarded. Her eyes moved over the space, taking in the sparse furniture, the unfinished edges of a life that was more survival than living. She didn't say anything, but Caleb could feel the tension in her presence. She was fighting something, fighting herself, maybe, and he knew that it wasn't just the past she was struggling with. It was the future, too. A future she hadn't wanted, hadn't chosen, but now found herself bound to. "I'm not going to make you do anything," Caleb said, his voice quiet as he began pulling ingredients from the cupboards. He didn't look at her as he spoke. He wasn't asking her to be grateful, to show some sign of relief. He just needed her to know that this place, this house, wasn't a prison. Not for her. He wasn't asking for anything in return. Mercy didn't respond at first, but Caleb noticed the way her shoulders dropped slightly, the smallest bit of tension easing from her body. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. She wasn't ready to trust him, but she wasn't ready to push him away either. They worked in silence, Caleb preparing a simple meal, mostly bread and beans, the kind of food he ate alone most nights. He could feel Mercy's eyes on him, but she didn't say a word. She wasn't a talker, and Caleb wasn't one to force conversation. The food was simple, but it was nourishing. Caleb set the plate down in front of her, and for the first time since they'd met, Mercy met his gaze directly. She looked at the food for a moment, then back at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but steady. It wasn't a lot, just a simple acknowledgement, but it was something. It was the first time she had spoken to him without hesitation, without the wall she had built around herself. "Don't mention it," Caleb replied, giving her a small nod. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need anything from her. She was here because he couldn't leave her, and that was all. Mercy picked up her fork slowly, like she was unfamiliar with the gesture, unsure of how to proceed. She didn't seem hungry at first, just poking at the food absent-mindedly. But after a moment, she started eating, slowly at first, as though testing the comfort of the meal, the quiet of the house, and Caleb's company. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes without needing words. Caleb ate his own food, keeping his attention on the task at hand, not wanting to pressure her into conversation. He wasn't asking her to open up yet. He knew it would take time. As the meal ended, the night settled around them. Caleb cleaned up while Mercy sat in the corner, her back straight, but her posture softening with each passing moment. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She was a woman with her own life, her own story, and he knew that she was more than just someone he had saved from the tracks. "Where are you from?" Caleb asked softly, breaking the silence as he wiped down the table. He didn't expect her to answer immediately. It wasn't a question for her to answer right away. It was just a way of keeping the moment from slipping into nothingness. Mercy didn't respond at first, and Caleb thought she might remain silent. But then she spoke, her voice low and strained, as if digging up memories she wasn't ready to face. "Does it matter?" Caleb paused, considering her words. "Not to me," he said simply. "I just want to know who you are." Her eyes flickered briefly, but she didn't say anything more. She was still holding herself back, still wrapped in layers of pain and distrust. Caleb knew better than to push her. She would share her own time. For now, they were two people in a house made of wood and silence, each carrying their own scars, but somehow finding a quiet place to rest. The days that followed were quieter, with a sense of normalcy settling over the ranch in the way the sun rose and set with predictable certainty. Caleb and Mercy fell into a routine, each of them carrying on with their tasks in silence. But the unspoken bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Mercy's pregnancy, though a silent weight, became more apparent with each week, and Caleb couldn't help but notice the way her hands rested on her belly sometimes, as if she were trying to shield the life inside her from a world that had only shown her pain. It wasn't until the third week after Mercy had arrived that Caleb realized just how much her presence had begun to affect him. He hadn't planned on growing attached, hadn't expected to care about the woman he'd found on the tracks. But as he watched her, he felt the stirrings of something deep inside him. The protective instinct, the same one he'd buried after his wife's death, began to surface once again. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he couldn't stand to see her suffer. One evening, as the wind began to shift, the air turning cooler with the coming of the night, Caleb noticed something different. Mercy hadn't been her usual self that day. Her movements slower, her breathing more labored. When he asked if she was all right, she gave him a vague response, saying she was just tired. Caleb didn't press, but something in her tone made him uneasy. Later that night, as he sat on the porch, cleaning his rifle and watching the night fall over the ranch, Mercy came to him, her face pale and her eyes wide with concern. Her hands were trembling, and Caleb could see the sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cool air. "I don't feel right," Mercy whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Without a word, Caleb stood up quickly, his instincts kicking in. He had no experience with pregnancy, but the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. He helped her to the cabin, his hands steady as he guided her to the small bed where she had been resting for the past few weeks. "You need to lie down," Caleb said, his voice unusually soft, almost tender. Mercy, her face drawn with pain, climbed into bed with Caleb's help, her body tense, her eyes squeezed shut. He could see the fear in her, but it was a different kind of fear, one that didn't just come from physical pain, but from something deeper, something she'd been holding inside. "The baby, it's coming," she gasped between shallow breaths, her hands gripping the edge of the blanket. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. He had no idea what to do. His mind raced for any memory of what he'd heard or read, but all he could think of was the woman before him and the fragile life she carried. "Okay, just breathe," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice steady. He had no experience with this, but he had to stay calm for her. He placed a hand on her forehead, his touch gentle as he moved to her side. Mercy's breathing grew more shallow, and Caleb could see the strain in her face. He couldn't let her be afraid. He didn't know how to help her in this moment, but he knew he couldn't leave her alone. The fear of losing her, of seeing her in pain, pushed him to act. "I'm here," Caleb whispered, kneeling beside her. "Just breathe, Mercy. We'll get through this." The night stretched long as Mercy's contractions came in waves. Caleb stayed by her side, offering whatever comfort he could, his hand on her back as she grimaced in pain. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the moon had shifted across the sky when Mercy let out a sharp cry. The sound of her pain broke something inside Caleb, a knot of helplessness forming in his chest. But he remained by her side, encouraging her, telling her she was doing great, though he knew his words were more for his own comfort than hers. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, each moment heavier than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, there was a quiet sound, the cry of a newborn baby. Caleb froze, his heart leaping in his chest. Mercy's body went limp against the bed, her breath shallow as she struggled to stay conscious. "It's okay," Caleb whispered urgently, moving to the baby's side. His hands were trembling as he gently lifted the newborn, his mind racing with the realization that he had no idea what to do next. But the baby, small and fragile, was breathing. It was alive. Caleb looked down at the little girl in his arms, her tiny hands curling into fists, her face scrunched up in confusion and discomfort. "Mercy," Caleb said, looking back at her. She had fainted from the exhaustion of the delivery. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't let her be alone in this. He laid the baby gently on her chest, making sure she was okay, his eyes scanning her body, checking for any signs of more distress. The baby's cries were faint now, but Caleb couldn't tear his eyes away from her. She was so tiny, so vulnerable. Slowly, Mercy began to stir, her eyes fluttering open as she took in the sight of her child. Her face softened, a small, exhausted smile crossing her lips. "It's a girl," she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb nodded, his own heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't expected. The girl, the life they had just fought for, was a reminder of how fragile it all was. "I'm here," Caleb said quietly. "You're not alone." Mercy's hand reached out, weak but determined, as she gently touched her baby's tiny hand. She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with something Caleb had never seen in them before. It wasn't just gratitude. It was relief. It was trust. The baby settled against Mercy's chest, and for the first time since she had come into his life, there was peace in the room. Caleb looked down at them, both of them exhausted and battered, but they were safe now. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow or the next day, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never let them go. The days following the birth were quiet but filled with a kind of tension that was impossible to ignore. Mercy's baby, a fragile little girl, was a constant reminder of the fragile hope that had come into their lives. Mercy, though still recovering, had already taken to caring for her baby with a fierce protectiveness. Caleb watched from the sidelines, offering what help he could, but Mercy didn't seem to need much. She wasn't the kind of woman who asked for help. She never had been. The ranch had become a sanctuary for them, and Caleb was beginning to see it as home once more. It wasn't much, just a small, worn house and a few acres of land, but it had provided them with peace, something neither of them had had in years. Still, there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that they were living on borrowed time and that something was waiting to break. The first real test came when Mercy's family showed up. Caleb was out tending to the horses when he saw the dust rising in the distance. It was late afternoon, the sky already beginning to fade into the soft, golden light of evening, and he couldn't help but feel a chill as the shape of a wagon appeared on the horizon. Mercy had been inside with the baby, resting. Caleb hesitated for a moment, knowing what was coming. He didn't want to see them, didn't want to see her past come rushing back like a flood. But he couldn't keep her hidden forever. She wasn't his to protect from her past. He wasn't sure what would happen when they arrived, but he knew it wouldn't be good. The wagon came to a halt in front of the house, and Caleb stood there, waiting. The moment the door opened, he saw them, the same people who had abandoned Mercy on those tracks. Her father, a tall, thin man whose sharp features looked as though they were carved from stone, stepped out first. He didn't say a word to Caleb, just looked him over, his gaze cold and calculating. The rest of the family followed, their expressions stiff, as if they were just going through the motions of showing up. Mercy appeared at the door, her face a mask of neutrality, but Caleb could see the tension in her posture. She wasn't ready for this. Her family had never been kind to her, and the scars ran deep. They had sold her like cattle, left her die, and now they were back, no doubt wanting something in return. "What do you want?" Mercy's voice was sharp, the quiet anger simmering just beneath the surface. Her father stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "We've come to see the child," he said, his tone dismissive. "You've been gone long enough. It's time you came back to your place. You don't belong out here in the dirt, living with this man." Caleb's jaw clenched at the tone in the man's voice. He didn't like what he was hearing. He didn't like the way they were treating Mercy like she was an object, a thing to be moved and controlled. This wasn't their decision to make. Not anymore. You don't get to decide where she belongs, Caleb said, his voice low but firm. His stance was solid, his body language making it clear he wasn't going to back down. She's not going anywhere. Mercy's father took a step closer, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You think you've saved her? He spat. You're just another man who's going to leave her when it's convenient. You don't know what you're dealing with, cowboy. She'll break again, just like she always does. Caleb's gaze didn't waver. He didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of Mercy's presence behind him, and he knew this was her fight. But he wasn't going to let her face it alone. She's not broken, Caleb replied, his voice quiet but unwavering. She's stronger than you'll ever understand, and she's not going back with you. Mercy stood in the doorway, watching the exchange. She hadn't spoken yet, hadn't said a word, but her eyes were fixed on her father. Her shoulders were tense, her fists clenched at her sides, but she wasn't shaking. She was holding herself together in a way Caleb had never seen before. She wasn't the scared woman he had found on the tracks. She had become someone else entirely, someone who could stand up to her past and face it head on. You don't get to decide what happens to me anymore, Mercy said, her voice steady and strong. I'm not going back. I'm staying here, with my child, and with him. She looked at Caleb then, her gaze softer, filled with something he couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe, or the first hints of trust. Her father's face twisted with rage. You're making a mistake, Mercy, he growled. You're nothing but a burden to him. And when he sees that, when he gets tired of you, he'll throw you out just like the rest of us did. Caleb stepped forward then, his expression cold. You can leave now, or I can make you leave. Your choice. There was a long moment of silence, and then Mercy's father, with a snarl, turned and walked back toward the wagon. His family followed, the weight of their disappointment heavy in the air. They didn't say another word as they climbed into the wagon and drove away, the dust settling behind them. Mercy didn't speak. She stood in the doorway, watching them go, her face unreadable. Caleb didn't approach her at first, letting her have the space to process what had just happened. When he finally did, he walked slowly toward her, unsure of what to say. He didn't need to say much. She knew he was there for her. You're not going back with them, Caleb said quietly, his voice firm but gentle. You're free now. This is your life. Mercy didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned away from him and walked back inside, her footsteps slow but purposeful. Caleb followed her in, his gaze softening as he watched her move. Thank you, she said, her voice small, but the weight of those words was more than he expected. It wasn't just a thank you for what he'd done. It was a thank you for something deeper, the trust that had finally begun to form between them. Mercy moved to the crib where her baby lay sleeping, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. She stood there for a moment, watching her daughter before turning to Caleb. Her eyes were soft now, her shoulders relaxed. I'm staying here, she said simply, the finality in her words a promise to herself and to him. Caleb nodded, his heart swelling with something he hadn't expected, hope. The days after Mercy's confrontation with her family seemed to settle into a strange kind of peace. The storm that had clouded over her life was far from gone, but for the first time, it felt like there was room for something new to take root. Caleb watched as Mercy moved through her days with a quiet, steady confidence, and though the silence between them remained, it was no longer uncomfortable. It felt like a quiet understanding, a silent agreement to let things unfold in their own time. Mercy took to her new role on the ranch with a sense of purpose. She didn't need to be asked. She helped Caleb with the chores, cleaned the cabin, and even started working with the animals, though she was still hesitant around the horses. But she was strong, and Caleb could see that she was starting to find a rhythm in the life she had once abandoned. Her baby, though still small and fragile, was thriving, and every time Mercy looked at her daughter, Caleb could see the bond between them growing stronger. The mornings were quiet, the two of them working side by side in a peaceful routine, but it was the nights that always felt different. Caleb, who had been so used to being alone, began to notice the small changes in the air when Mercy was near. Her presence no longer felt like an interruption. It felt like something that belonged, like something he had been missing for years. One evening, after a long day's work, Caleb found himself sitting outside on the porch, the soft sound of crickets filling the night air. He had a cup of coffee in his hands, the warmth of it a small comfort against the cool breeze that was rolling in. Mercy was inside, the baby sleeping soundly in the room just behind him. It had become a routine. Mercy would put the baby down, and Caleb would sit outside, letting his thoughts settle into the quiet of the night. It was in these quiet moments that Caleb found himself thinking more and more about what had brought him to this place. He had never wanted a family again, not after his wife's death. He hadn't wanted anything to change. But here, with Mercy and the baby, things were changing. He could feel it in his bones. And no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more than just a temporary arrangement. Mercy appeared at the door, her silhouette framed by the soft light from inside the cabin. She stepped out onto the porch, her gaze soft as she looked at him. She didn't say anything at first, but Caleb could tell she was thinking about something that had been on her mind, just like it had been on his. "Mercy," Caleb said, his voice quiet but steady. "We need to talk." She nodded, her eyes still holding that quiet intensity. She walked over and sat down beside him, her movements slow but deliberate, as though she were testing the ground between them, unsure of where to place herself. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The night hung around them, thick with anticipation, but neither was ready to break the silence until Caleb took a deep breath and finally said the words that had been sitting on the edge of his mind for days. "I don't know what's going to happen, Mercy," Caleb started, his voice low and honest. "I don't know what we're doing here. I didn't plan on any of this. I didn't plan on you. I didn't plan on this ranch being anything other than a place to hide from the world." Mercy shifted slightly beside him, her gaze soft but unreadable. Caleb could feel the weight of her silence, but he needed to say this. For both of them. "But what I do know is this," Caleb continued, turning to face her. "I care about you, more than I thought I could, more than I should. And I'm asking you now, because I don't know if I'll ever get another chance. Will you stay with me, Mercy? Not just here. Will you stay with me? On this ranch, in this life, together?" Mercy's expression remained unchanged, but the faintest flicker in her eyes told Caleb that his words had reached her, had gotten past the wall she had so carefully built. She turned her head slightly, looking away for a moment, as if sorting through the thoughts and emotions that had built up inside her. She wasn't ready to make any decisions yet, but Caleb could feel the shift. The moment stretched, and Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He had never been good at this. The opening up, the vulnerability. He wasn't the type of man who asked for much, who expected anything in return. But this was different. He wasn't asking for her to fix him or to save him. He was just asking for her to be with him. Mercy turned back toward him, her lips parted as if she were about to speak. But then she hesitated. Her eyes flicked over to the house, where their daughter lay asleep, her tiny form peaceful in the soft glow of the cabin light. "I don't want to be alone anymore," Mercy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be the woman who's always waiting for the next betrayal, the next person to leave me. I don't want to be scared anymore." Caleb's chest tightened at her words, and for the first time, he saw the cracks in her armor, the raw vulnerability that had been buried deep inside her for so long. "I'm not going anywhere, Mercy," Caleb said quietly, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I'm here, and I want you to stay, not just because of the baby, but because you're not alone anymore. You don't have to be." Mercy's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, the silence between them was filled with understanding, a deep, unspoken bond that neither of them could deny. "Then stay," she said, her voice steady now, the walls finally crumbling away. "I'll stay. For you. For us." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since Mercy had arrived at the ranch, Caleb felt the weight of what he had built: a life, a family, a future that was no longer defined by past mistakes. Without another word, Caleb stood up, offering his hand to her. Mercy took it without hesitation, the connection between them undeniable. They didn't need to say anything more. The quiet understanding between them was enough. Later that night, after the baby had been fed and Mercy had settled into bed, Caleb sat on the porch again, his gaze drifting to the stars above. The world felt different now. Not perfect, but real. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid to face it. With Mercy by his side, there was nothing they couldn't handle. And as the night stretched on, Caleb realized he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a family, a home, and the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures or promises. It was the kind of love that grew in the quiet spaces between two people who had learned to stop running.